January 28th, 1918. Just after midnight, the village of Porvenir sits in the West Texas desert, 30 miles south of Marfa. A handful of adobe homes, a small school, families asleep under a cold winter sky. Then, hoofbeats, dozens of riders approaching through the darkness. Texas Rangers, U.S. cavalry soldiers, local ranchers, all armed, all looking for someone to blame. Doors are kicked open. Men are dragged from their beds. Children scream. Women beg. The air is filled with shouts in English and Spanish, the sound of rifles being cocked, the scrape of boots on stone floors. 15 men are pulled from their homes. Farmers, ranchers, fathers, grandfathers, some still in their night clothes. None are armed. They are marched into the desert, away from the village, away from their families. And then the shooting begins. The gunfire echoes across the valley. Muzzle flashes light up the darkness. And when it stops, 15 men lie dead in the dirt. By sunrise, the survivors are fleeing across the Rio Grande into Mexico. By the end of the week, Porvenir, a village that had existed for generations, is abandoned. By the end of the year, it no longer exists. This is the story of the Porvenir Massacre, one of the darkest chapters in Texas Ranger history, a night of violence that the state tried to bury for over a century, and it's time we dug it up. To understand what happened at Porvenir, you have to understand the chaos along the Texas-Mexico border in the 1910s. It was a war zone. In 1910, the Mexican Revolution began. For the next decade, Mexico was torn apart by civil war. Revolutionary armies, federal troops, bandit gangs, and warlords fought for control. Millions of people were displaced. Hundreds of thousands died, and the violence didn't stop at the border. Bandits crossed into Texas, raiding ranches, stealing cattle and horses, killing anyone who resisted. Some were revolutionaries looking for supplies. Others were criminals taking advantage of the chaos. And some were Tejanos, Mexican Americans, who had lived in Texas for generations, but were now being pushed off their land by Anglo ranchers and developers. The raids were real. The violence was real. But the fear, the paranoia, was even worse. Every unsolved theft was blamed on Mexican bandits. Every crime, every missing cow, every broken fence was evidence of an invasion. Anglo ranchers demanded protection. Newspapers published sensational stories about Mexican raiders terrorizing white families, and the Texas Rangers answered the call. The Rangers in the 1910s were not the romantic lawmen of legend. They were a paramilitary force operating with almost no oversight. They had the authority to arrest, to kill, to enforce the law as they saw fit. And in South Texas, that meant one thing: terrorizing the Mexican and Tejano population. Rangers would ride into Mexican communities and demand information. They would arrest men without evidence, beat them, torture them, sometimes kill them. And if anyone complained, the Rangers would say the victims were bandits, criminals, enemies of Texas. There were no body cameras, no oversight committees, no accountability. Just a badge, a gun, and the word of a ranger against a dead man. And in 1917, Company B of the Texas Rangers arrived in the Big Bend region under the command of Captain J.M. Fox. Fox was ambitious, ruthless, and he believed every Mexican was a potential bandit. Let's talk about the people whose lives collided in Porvenir. Porvenir was a small village, maybe 40 or 50 residents. Most were Tejanos, Mexican Americans who had been born in Texas or had lived there for decades. They were farmers, ranchers, laborers. They raised cattle, grew crops, tried to survive in one of the harshest environments in Texas. Among them, Longino Flores, a rancher in his 40s, a respected member of the community, father of several children. Juan Jimenez, a farmhand, quiet, hard-working, known for keeping to himself. Antonio Castañeda, an elderly man who had lived in Porvenir for over 30 years. Macedonio Huertas, a teenager, barely 17 years old. These were not revolutionaries, not bandits, not criminals. They were people, living their lives, trying to get by. Captain J.M. Fox was the kind of ranger who believed the border needed to be controlled by any means necessary. He had been stationed in the Big Bend region for years and had a reputation for being aggressive, quick to violence, and dismissive of Mexican lives. To Fox, every Mexican was a suspect. Every Tejano community was a potential hideout for bandits, and he had the authority and the willingness to act on those suspicions. Henry Warren was a wealthy Anglo rancher who owned thousands of acres in West Texas. In December 1917, his son was killed during a raid on one of his ranches. The raiders were never identified, but Warren wanted revenge, and he wanted the Rangers to get it for him. J.T. Canales, Jose Tomas Canales, was a Tejano state representative from South Texas. He was educated, connected, and deeply troubled by the violence he was seeing along the border. He had received reports of Ranger abuses, beatings, killings, intimidation, but he was one man, and the Rangers were an institution. Still, Canales would not stay silent, and within a year, he would become the Rangers' most dangerous enemy. December 1917. A ranch owned by Henry Warren was raided. Raiders stole horses and supplies, and they killed Warren's son. Warren was devastated, furious, and he wanted blood. He went to the Rangers, he went to the U.S. cavalry stationed in the area, and he demanded they find the men responsible. But there was no evidence pointing to anyone, no witnesses, no leads, just theories and rumors, and one of those rumors pointed to Porvenir. Why Porvenir? It's unclear. Maybe because it was a Mexican village close to the site of the raid. Maybe because some of the men from Porvenir worked on ranches in the area and were known to Fox. Maybe because Fox needed someone to blame and Porvenir was convenient. Whatever the reason, Fox became convinced that the people of Porvenir were involved. He had no proof, no witnesses, no evidence, but he didn't need it. In January 1918, Fox and a group of rangers, along with local ranchers and some members of the U.S. cavalry, began preparing for a raid on Porvenir. The official story would be that they were investigating the raid on Warren's ranch, that they were looking for bandits, that they were protecting Texas. But the people of Porvenir knew better. They had seen this before. They knew what happened when the Rangers came looking for someone to blame. Some families considered fleeing, but where would they go? This was their home. They had lived here for years. They had done nothing wrong. Surely they would be safe. They were wrong. Just after midnight, the riders came. A posse of Texas Rangers, 4 local ranchers, and a company of 8th Cavalry troops who had been brought along for support. Though only the Rangers and the ranchers did the killing, they surrounded the village, dismounted, and began kicking in doors. Families woke to the sound of shouting and boots on wooden floors. Children cried, women screamed, men were dragged from their beds before they could even understand what was happening. Captain Fox was in command. He ordered his men to round up all the adult males in the village. The Rangers went door to door. They pulled men from their homes, some still in their night clothes, some barefoot. They lined them up in the center of the village while their families watched, terrified. 15 men in total. The Rangers claimed they were looking for the men who had raided Warren's ranch. But they didn't ask questions. They didn't search for evidence. They didn't even pretend to investigate. They just took them in. The families begged. Wives pleaded for their husbands. Children clung to their fathers. The Rangers shoved them away. One woman later testified that she heard a ranger say, "We're gonna kill them all." The 15 men were marched out of the village, east toward a rocky hillside about a quarter-mile away from witnesses, away from light. The families stood in the darkness, listening, waiting, praying, and then they heard the gunshots. A volley, then scattered shots, then silence. The women and children ran toward the sound, but the Rangers stopped them. Guns raised, orders shouted, "Stay back." When the Rangers finally left, just before dawn, the families rushed to the hillside. They found their husbands, their fathers, their sons. All 15 men lay dead, executed with rifle fire, their bodies left in the dirt. No trial, no charges, no investigation, just execution. By the next morning, the survivors of Porvenir were fleeing. They gathered what they could carry: food, blankets, a few possessions, and headed south toward the Rio Grande. Women carried children. The elderly struggled to keep up. They crossed the river into Mexico, into the village of Pilares, and never returned. Porvenir was abandoned. Within weeks, the buildings began to collapse. The school closed. The fields went unplanted. The village, home to families for generations, simply ceased to exist. And the Rangers, they claimed the men they killed were bandits, criminals, raiders. Captain Fox filed a report stating that the men of Porvenir had resisted arrest, that they were armed, that the Rangers had acted in self-defense. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Several U.S. cavalry officers later confirmed in sworn testimony that the victims were unarmed and had not resisted. But those reports were buried. The Rangers controlled the narrative. And in 1918, Texas, the word of a Ranger was gospel, except to one man. Jose Tomas Canales had been hearing stories about Ranger violence for years. Beatings, murders, entire communities terrorized. But Porvenir was different. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a massacre. 15 unarmed men executed in front of their families, and the Rangers were covering it up. Canales decided to act. In January 1919, exactly 1 year after the massacre, Canales introduced a resolution in the Texas legislature calling for an investigation into the Texas Rangers. He presented a list of charges, specific cases of abuse, murder, and misconduct by Rangers across South Texas. He named names. He provided testimony from witnesses, and he demanded accountability. The response was immediate and vicious. Ranger supporters called Canales a traitor, a Mexican sympathizer, an enemy of Texas. He received death threats. Rangers followed him, intimidated witnesses, made it clear that anyone who testified against them would pay a price. But Canales did not back down. In February 1919, the Texas legislature held hearings. For weeks, Canales presented evidence. He called witnesses, survivors, U.S. Army officers, even some former Rangers who were willing to tell the truth. He detailed the massacre at Porvenir, the lack of evidence, the execution of unarmed men, the cover-up, and for the first time, the Texas Rangers were forced to answer for their actions. The hearings were explosive. Witnesses testified about Rangers killing unarmed men, about torture, about entire communities living in fear. U.S. Army officers confirmed that the men killed at Porvenir had been unarmed, that there had been no resistance. Captain J.M. Fox was called to testify. He stuck to his story. The men were bandits. They had resisted arrest. The Rangers had acted appropriately. But under questioning, his story began to fall apart. Why were there no weapons found on the bodies? Why were the men shot multiple times? Why were there no arrests, no trials? Fox had no good answers. Other Rangers testified. Some defended Fox. Others admitted reluctantly that things had gotten out of hand. A few even acknowledged that innocent people had been killed, but none of them called it murder. The hearings went on for weeks. Newspapers across Texas covered the story. Some supported Canals, calling for reform. Others defended the Rangers, claiming they were being unfairly attacked for doing a dangerous job. And then came the verdict. The Texas legislature acknowledged that abuses had occurred. They admitted that reforms were needed. They passed a bill reducing the size of the Ranger force and creating some oversight. But they did not disband the Rangers. They did not charge anyone with murder. They did not apologize to the families of Porvenir. Captain J.M. Fox was forced to resign in disgrace a year later, but no criminal charges, and the families of Porvenir, still living in exile in Mexico, received nothing. No justice, no compensation, not even an acknowledgement that their loved ones had been murdered. For decades, Porvenir was forgotten. The massacre wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't mentioned in Texas history books. The few historians who knew about it treated it as a footnote, a minor incident in the violent history of the border. The survivors and their descendants kept the story alive. They told their children, their grandchildren. They remembered the names of the men who were killed. They remembered the night the Rangers came. But in Texas, the story was buried. Why? Because it was inconvenient. Because it complicated the mythology of the Texas Rangers. Because acknowledging what happened at Porvenir meant admitting that the Rangers, symbols of Texas law and order, had committed murder. And Texas wasn't ready to do that. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. In the 2000s, historians began re-examining the Porvenir Massacre. They found the U.S. cavalry reports. They interviewed descendants of the victims. They pieced together what had actually happened that night. And they found something stunning. The massacre was even worse than anyone had thought. Not only had the Rangers executed 15 unarmed men, they had done it with the full knowledge and approval of local authorities. And the cover-up had been systematic, involving multiple levels of government. In 2018, 100 years after the massacre, something remarkable happened. The Texas Historical Commission approved a historical marker for Porvenir. It would be placed near the site of the village, acknowledging what had happened and honoring the victims. It was a small gesture, but for the descendants of those 15 men, it was monumental. For the first time, the state of Texas was officially acknowledging the massacre, saying the names of the victims, admitting that what happened was wrong. The marker was unveiled in a ceremony attended by descendants, historians, and officials. One descendant, Arlinda Valencia, whose grandfather was killed that night, spoke about what it meant to finally have the truth recognized. She said her family had carried the story for a century, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to care. And finally, someone did. In recent years, DPS leadership has privately acknowledged to descendants that the massacre was murder, and the 2018 state historical marker finally told the truth. It was too late for the victims, too late for the survivors, but it was something. A recognition, an admission, a small step toward accountability. The Porvenir Massacre isn't just history. It's a reflection of who we are and who we've been. It's a reminder that symbols we hold up as heroes, like the Texas Rangers, are complicated. That institutions we trust can commit terrible wrongs. And that the victims of those wrongs are often the people with the least power to demand justice. The men killed at Porvenir were not bandits. They were not criminals. They were farmers and ranchers who happened to be Mexican in a time and place where that was enough to get you killed. And they were killed by men who wore badges, men who represented the law, men who faced no consequences for what they did. That's the part we can't forget. Because if we don't remember Porvenir, it could happen again. Maybe not in the same way. Maybe not with rangers riding into a village at night. But injustice doesn't need horses and rifles. It just needs people in power who believe some lives matter less than others. The story of Porvenir is uncomfortable. It challenges the way we think about Texas, about law enforcement, about who gets to write history. But that discomfort is necessary. Because history isn't just about celebrating the past, it's about confronting it, learning from it, and making sure we don't repeat it. Today, there's nothing left of Porvenir. The buildings are gone. The school is gone. Even the road that led to the village has been reclaimed by the desert. But if you drive to that remote corner of West Texas, near the Rio Grande, you'll find a historical marker. It lists the names of the 15 men who were killed. It tells their story. And it reminds us that they were here, that they lived, that they mattered, that they were murdered, and that for 100 years, no one wanted to talk about it. Texas history isn't just cowboys and heroes. It isn't just the Alamo and Independence. It's also stories like Porvenir, stories of violence, injustice, and the long fight for truth. These stories are hard to tell. They're hard to hear. But they're ours. And we owe it to the people who lived them and died in them to remember. The men of Porvenir deserve justice. They didn't get it in 1918. They didn't get it in 1919. But maybe, a century later, they're finally getting something close. Recognition. Acknowledgement. Truth. It's not enough. But it's a start. This is Texas. This is our history. And it's time we told the whole story. If you want more real Texas history, the stories that challenge us, that make us think, that force us to confront uncomfortable truths, hit that like button and subscribe to Texas Tales. Because the past isn't past. It's still here. Still shaping who we are. And the only way forward is to remember.